Psalm 74 is a dramatic first-hand description of the devastation that the Babylonians wrought on the Jewish temple. As a psalm of Asaph, we assume that this is one of the priests, so he was very likely in the temple itself or in its confines as the Babylonian army came through the breach in the walls and just began to slaughter people left and right, and then proceed to go to the temple and to take the sacred objects and smash them and set the temple on fire. This is the story, the psalm of a survivor, and the immediate trauma and horror and questions that this event raised in his mind. For us, we might think of any number of man-made disasters in our lifetime, the fall of the Twin Towers on 9/11, or other terrorist attacks that just defy our understanding, school shootings, mass murders, these things that traumatize us and raise serious theological questions for us. This psalm just dives right into the heart of it. The psalm begins with a question, and it is a fundamental question that is asked in this psalm and many others in Book 3. Oh God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? That's a good question, isn't it? It seems that God has abandoned his own flock. He is the good shepherd, and yet it seems that he has abandoned his flock to the wolves. Verse 2 is a request. Remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old. This is a loaded prayer, isn't it? God, remember us. Have you forgotten? You redeemed us. Remember your house. Remember Mount Zion, where you dwelt. Basically, it's not as much as a request as an accusation. God, you've forgotten us, haven't you? You've left your house. Verse 3 is a request to take a look, God. Direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in the sanctuary. Look at this, God. Walk there. Walk through the ruins. Tell me what you see. Verse 4, your foes have roared in the midst of your meeting place, the place where we sang songs to you and offered sacrifices. Your foes, they're the ones that were singing and roaring and shouting in that place. They've set up their own signs for signs. In other words, their battle standards, their flags of war. They were like those who swing axes in a forest of trees. They were just like swinging a machete, hacking through a forest. And all of its carved wood they broke down with hatchets and hammers. They set your sanctuary on fire. They profaned the dwelling place of your name, bringing it down to the ground. They said to themselves, we will utterly subdue them. And they burned all the meeting places of God in the land. So not even just the temple, but any place where God was worshipped in the land. The Babylonians made certain that that place was no more. This is a major theological statement that the Babylonians were making, that our gods are bigger than your God. The psalmist continues his lament. We do not see our signs. There is no longer any prophet. There's none among us who knows how long. You see, just a century or so earlier, 701 BC, when the Assyrians invaded, God rescued them in a very dramatic way. But this time, there was nothing. There were no signs. There was no prophet. There was no good news. And here's the kicker. None of us knows how. It's the second question is God, you've abandoned us, and how long is this going to last? When is this going to be over? In verse 11, then, the psalmist returns to his original question, why? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the fold of your garment and destroy them. God, why aren't you responding? Why do you have your hands in your pocket? God, do something. Fix this. Wow, how many times have we prayed this when we have faced some kind of trauma? I've been in college ministry for most of my life, and I have been present at funerals of young people. And I've asked this very question, God, why? Why didn't you stop that car from crossing the line? Why didn't you cause that trucker to put on his brakes just a little sooner? Why didn't you direct that tornado a little different direction? I've attended the funerals of students, and I've asked God that question. Why? Why did you have your hands in your pockets? You could have done something, God. All of us have been there. All of us have asked those questions. And if that's the case, this psalm is for you. Because following this accusation in verse 11, That's what it really is. There is a yet God. There is a yet God. There's a statement of God is still on the throne. God is my king. He is from of old. He is working salvation in the midst of the earth. God is still at work in the midst of this. And to remind us of that, the psalmist takes us back to creation. He says, you divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan, gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Let's take a minute and unpack this, because this seems a bit foreign to us. The first word there in verse 13, sea monsters, is how it's translated, or great sea creatures. In Hebrew is the tananim. Take a look at how this word is used in other places of Scripture. It's in Genesis 1, in creation, the great sea creatures of the waters. In Job 7, the same word is used of a sea monster. Psalm 148, great sea creatures as well. Elsewhere, we see that it's simply translated as serpent, even a small snake. So there's some variety in how this word is used, but the implication is of these are the greatest of the sea creatures, whether they are whales or dragons or sea monsters or squids. We cannot identify them with any kind of certainty. Then there is Leviathan, the second word that's used in this text. Job references Leviathan first as some fearsome monster who's ready to rouse Leviathan. He spends an entire chapter, and this is actually God speaking in Job 41, describing a dragon-like creature, breathing fire with scales, fearsome. And then in Psalm 104, there's a reference to a Leviathan that's frolicking, that's playing in the water, that's sort of God's pet, God's plaything. And then Isaiah 27 speaks of Leviathan as the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent, the dragon that is in the sea. And of course, in all of Scripture, often we see the greatest enemy of all, Satan, personified as a dragon or as a serpent. So we take all of that information and we go back to our psalm and we add one other bit of information that's significant. And that is that the Babylonians had stories of creation in the Enuma Elish, the epic Babylonian creation story. There are gods and monsters. There is Apsu, the god of the fresh water, and there is Tiamat, the goddess of the ocean water. And they believe that there were 7 gods that resided inside of Tiamat. They were all mentioned by name, 11 sea monsters inside of the ocean goddess Tiamat. One of them, Marduk, the storm god, rises to power and destroys her. He kills his own mother. He cuts her body in half, and half of it becomes the earth, half of it becomes the sky, and then creates the sun, the moon, the stars, the weather. And it's the story of creation. And it comes out of this picture of chaos, of an uprising, and a killing of the goddess Tiamat by a sea monster. And so the psalmist takes this Babylonian story. Remember, they're in captivity in Babylon. This story would have been very familiar to the Jewish people. And he says, in fact, it was God in creation that subdued the chaos, the sea monsters, the Leviathan, and gave them as food for the creatures of the wilderness. It was God who took the chaos that existed before the order of creation, and he placed it in order. In verse 16, yours is the day, yours is the night, the heavenly lights, the sun. You've fixed the boundaries of the earth. You've made summer and winter. You've fixed a boundary for the waters. They cannot cross. They cannot come upon the land. And so God is a God of order, not of chaos. He takes the chaos that's described here in verses 1 through 11, this destruction of the temple, the end of the nation, and God demonstrates through creation that he has power to take any level of chaos, including a sea monster, including a dragon. He has the power to subdue it and to order it. Which brings us to the conclusion of this psalm. It returns again to a prayer. Remember this, how the enemy scoffs, the foolish people revile your name. There's a prayer, a positive prayer, and then a negative statement of that. Do not deliver the soul of your dove. And remember, your dove is a metaphor, an animal that represents the nation of Israel. Don't forget the life of your poor forever. Don't give them over to the wild beasts, to the monsters, to the Babylonians. And then a positive statement, have regard for the covenant, for the dark places of the land are full of the habitations of violence. So remember your covenant. And then it's stated in the negative, verse 21, let not the downtrodden turn back in shame. Let the poor needy praise your name. Verse 22 in the positive, arise, defend your cause. Remember how the foolish scoff. And then in the negative, do not forget the clamor of your foes, the uproar of those who rise against you, which goes up continually. And so we see in these 6 verses 3 pairs of positive, negative, positive, negative statements, a poetic way of repetition and affirming ultimately through this prayer that, yes, God, we still trust in you. We recognize that the only way we're going to have any restoration of order from this chaos is by trusting in you. Before we leave the psalm, I want to reference how the psalm influenced Dietrich Bonhoeffer in history. Bonhoeffer was a German pastor during the early days of World War II. And as the persecution of the Jews began, Bonhoeffer made note of this psalm. The persecution of the Jews began with an event called the Kristallnacht. And Bonhoeffer, hearing the reports of that event, referred to Psalm 79. Turn your steps toward these everlasting ruins. All this destruction the enemy has brought on the sanctuary. Your foes roared in the place where you met with us. They set up their standards as signs. They behaved like men wielding axes to cut through a thicket of trees. They smashed all the carved paneling with their axes and hatchets. They burned your sanctuary to the ground. They defiled the dwelling place of your name. They said in their hearts, we will crush them completely. They burned every place where God was worshipped in the land. We're given no signs from God, no prophets are left, and none of us knows how long this will be. How long will the enemy mock you, God? Will the foe revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the folds of your garment and destroy them. It was on that day and that moment, and in relation to this psalm, that Bonhoeffer exhorted the German Christians to care for the Jews, to shelter them, and to work on their behalf. And Bonhoeffer himself would later join a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. So this psalm has meaning even today, as we see the persecution of Christians around the world. And we may ask ourselves, God, where are you? What are you doing in the midst of this? Know that the same God who subdued the chaos of creation has crushed the head of Satan, our greatest enemy. He has destroyed the one who holds the power of death, and he has set us free. Turn to that promise when you're asking God the question, God, why? Why were your hands in your pockets when I needed you? Know that God is working out salvation every day. He has a plan. He has a purpose. He is a God of order and victory. Put your trust in him.